Hey there! This video is going to be a beginner's guide to shooting in Cine EI on the Sony FX30. Until a recent firmware update on the FX3, Cine EI was only available on cameras like the FX6 and the FX9. So a lot of people buying the FX30, and maybe yourself included, have never used Cine EI. So in this video, I want to explain what it is, how to get started shooting with it, or maybe you may not want to shoot with it after you watch this. But either way, you'll understand what it is. If you're interested in more advanced features and nuances of shooting in Cine EI, I made a detailed video, which I will leave linked down below for you to check out. It was on the FX3, but it works exactly the same. Starting out, there are 3 ways to shoot in S-Log3 on the FX30, and I recommend that you shoot in S-Log3 to get the best possible image quality. You have flexible ISO, which the camera will operate just like it does on every other camera. You can change the exposure using ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. There's Cine EI Quick, which is a mode that I don't recommend, and I will talk about that a little bit later on the video. And then there's also Cine EI, which is what we're going to be talking about. So what is Cine EI? Well, first of all, you need to understand that the FX30 has a dual base ISO system, or a dual native ISO system. And the 2 base ISOs are 800 and 2500. So what is a dual base ISO? Well, if you have a dual base ISO system in your camera, the camera will perform similarly in terms of dynamic range and noise performance at those 2 ISO levels. And essentially, the camera will give you the best possible image quality at those base ISOs. So Cine EI forces the camera to only run at those 2 base ISOs to give you the best possible image quality. So just remember, if you're in Cine EI, you can only shoot at ISO 800 or 2500 on the FX30, and if you're on the FX3, it's 800 and 12,800. The EI of Cine EI stands for Exposure Index. Now the Exposure Index is something you can change on the camera, and what it does is it changes the exposure on the screen, but it doesn't change what's recorded to the memory card in the camera. Like I said, the camera can only record at 2 base ISOs, 800 and 2500. So if you take a look here, as I change the exposure index, you will see the exposure changing on the screen, but what's recorded to the camera does not change. So if you're curious, when you change the exposure index, it'll force you to over or underexpose the image to force more dynamic range to the shadows or the highlights. As I said, if you're curious about this, go check out that other video down below, but I don't want to get into this. Essentially, stick to the exposure index being the same as the base ISO. So if you're at the low base of 800, you'll leave the exposure index at 800. If you're at the high base of 2500, you will leave the exposure index at 2500. Well, hopefully at this point, I've drilled home the fact that when you're in Cine EI, you're only going to be shooting at ISO 800 or 2500. Now, if you're finding value in this video, I would really appreciate you hitting subscribe down below. That would be really cool. All right, so how do we shoot with Cine EI? Well, now we can't really change the ISO other than 800 or 2500. You want to set your shutter speed based on your frame rate. So if you're in 24 frames a second, you'll be at 1/50. If you're at 60 frames a second, you'll be at 1/125, etc. So because we've eliminated ISO in our exposure triangle, there are 4 ways we can control the exposure. We can switch the base ISO, we can change the aperture of the lens, we can change the ND that's on the lens, so either using a variable ND filter or taking the ND on or off, and then of course changing the lighting in the scene. So let's take a look at the camera now, and right now I am in flexible ISO mode, and I have the wheel in the back set to ISO, so if I change the ISO, you can see it changing the ISO on the screen like it normally does on any camera. So let's set this up to use Cine EI. So we press the menu button, and in the main menu, we go to the second page. You can see here, log shooting setting. So we're gonna select this. It's set up for flexible ISO right now. So we're gonna set this to Cine EI. So now when I go back to the main screen, you see it doesn't show ISO, it shows 800 EI, 6.0 E, and L. So this is your exposure index. This has to do with the stops of exposure over middle gray, and the L stands for the low base. So now when I change the ISO in the camera, it is now changing the exposure index. But like I said, I want to keep this at 800 when you're at the low base of 800, and you want to keep it at 2500 when you're at the high base of 2500. So I'm going to show you how I set up my camera in terms of customizing a few things. I made a detailed video about all the menu settings and all that kind of stuff in this camera. If you want to check that out, there'll be a video link down below. So as I said, we're going to set our shutter speed, so I don't want to change my shutter speed after I pick my frame rate, and then I don't want to change the exposure index. So let me show you a couple things that I do in the camera to help make my life a little bit easier. So if you press the menu, and we're going to go down to the suitcase and Operation Customize, we're going to change some of our custom key and dial settings. So if we go in here, the first thing I want to change is on the top, the ISO button, which is on the top here, button number 3. I'm going to change this to switching the base ISOs because I'm not going to change the ISO other than just at the bases. So I change this to base ISO switch. So now when I press that button on the top, it will change the base ISO from low to high. The next thing I want to change are some of my dials. So we go to the dial setting here, and the front dial here, and you don't have to change all these settings. As I said, this is just what I like to do. The front dial, as I usually have set to shutter speed, I don't want to change because I bump it accidentally all the time. So I just turn that off. So to do that, you go over to the suitcase, operation customize, not set. And the other thing, and this dial that's on the back, top of the back there, I have that set to aperture. And the wheel in the back, which I showed you earlier, was ISO or exposure index. I'm going to turn this off as well because I don't want to change that by accident. If I'm changing the exposure index, it's a very purposefully decided, or purposeful decision, and I want to make sure that I'm doing that and not doing it by accident. So there you go. That's how I've set this up. So if I go back out here, you can see that the wheel will not change the exposure index. If I want to change the base from low to high, I just hit that one button, and you'll see the base changing from low to high. You can see it both saying it on the screen here, and also the exposure index and the H will turn into an L. So there you go. Now you might be asking, how do I change my frame rates and stuff? Well, I go back into the main menu, and I'll just quickly change my frame rate to 60. And while I'm here, I'll just change my shutter speed. So again, it's pretty easy to change, but I just want to be really purposeful in how I'm using the camera, and I'm not changing the exposure index off of the bases. So that's basically how I set up and shoot with Cine EI. And just remember, when you're trying to dial in your exposure, you can change 4 different things. You can change which base ISO you're shooting at. You can change the aperture of the lens, the ND filtration, and the lighting. So now what about Cine EI Quick? Well, as I said before, I don't recommend it, but in case you're curious, let me show you exactly how this works so you just understand. So if we go into the menu and we go back to the main menu and change it to Cine EI Quick. Now when we back out, it'll shoot just like you did in Cine EI, but the difference here is that I did turn the wheel back on for ISO here. When you change the exposure index, you see it's at high right now. If I change it, it'll switch to low automatically. And so this is good if you're constantly changing your exposure index, but like I said, I recommend that you don't change your exposure index very often. And even me, I don't change my exposure index very often. And if I do, it's very purposeful. And so I will go in there and manually change it. So I don't recommend Cine EI Quick. So as you can see, shooting in Cine EI is definitely more limiting and not useful for everybody and in all situations. One thing that's different with the FX30 versus, let's say, the FX3 is that the second base ISO in this camera is only 2500 versus 12,800 in the FX3. So if you are shooting, weddings or events where there's lower light and the lighting's uncontrolled, you may want to push the ISO higher. And in that situation, you probably don't want to be shooting in Cine EI because you can't go above 2500. Now, if you're not comfortable with Cine EI or you're shooting in some of those situations, feel free to use flexible ISO instead. It shoots in the same S-Log3, S-Gamut3.Cine that you shoot in Cine EI. And remember, to get the best possible image quality in flexible ISO, shoot at either 800 or 2500. If you're curious about learning more about the exposure index and the more nuances of tweaking the exposure in this camera, go check out the video like I mentioned before over here, and this video over here will teach you how to use the XLR top handle. Thank you so much for watching. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.